Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Art of Parenting. Today is lesson 3 of our 6-week journey exploring Jewish insights and wisdom for raising children. And today's lesson is titled On Good Authority. And today's lesson picks up right where last week's lesson left off. And that is, last week we learned primarily about 2 aspects of parenting. Number 1 is modeling, and number 2 is guiding. And they kind of created a yin-yang, if you will. Two sides of the same coin, that if we want our children to have certain behavior, number 1, we need to have that behavior. We need to model that behavior for them. But on the other hand, modeling itself is not enough, and we need to actively get involved in guiding them. And the primary example that we gave, which we felt is the cornerstone of all parenting, is teaching our children self-discipline, right? Teaching our children to go against an instinct. It's one of the main things that differentiates a human being from an animal. And we have to be able to teach our children slowly and in small amounts, and then slowly growing that. We have to teach them how to want to do one thing and instead to do something else, to be a little bit more selfless in their behavior. And today we're going to teach a little bit of, we're going to learn a little bit about how to teach that to our children. And particularly, we're going to talk about authority. We're going to talk about what we're constantly telling our children what to do. What is the proper way to tell our children what to do? And as always, we will start today's lesson with a video teaser. Please, let me just make sure the sound is coming across. There we go. Please turn your attention to the video screens.
My 3-year-old is entering the why stage.
Why do I have to wear a coat?
Because it's cold outside and you have a touch of flu.
Why can't I have candy for dinner?
Eating your vegetables will help you grow and be strong.
Why do I have to clean my teeth?
If you don't clean your teeth, they'll rot, you'll have bad breath, and no one will want to marry you. Just kidding, I would never say that. Seriously though, I want to nurture my child's natural curiosity, but sometimes I'm in a hurry and I just need my kid to follow instructions. Put on your shoes. Oh, where are your shoes? I'm late for work. Growing up, I resented it when my father answered every question with, "Because I said so," and I promised myself I would never do that. But sometimes it seems like an attractive option. How would you respond?
All right. Before we dive into how we would respond, I just want to make sure, and it seems that that's the case, that only Victoria, for some reason, Miriam, it seems that you couldn't see the video, but it seems everybody else was able to see it. So you'll have to figure that out on your end. So we're going to begin today with a learning exercise. It's on page 66. You can open your books to page 66. And we have a question on the table. All right. This is, as usual, an exercise we're going to come back to later. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just intake so that you can kind of see where we started and where we went in today's lesson. The question on the table is, your daughter, your 10-year-old daughter, informs you that she is having an important math test next week. Okay? She'll need to study for many hours in order to pass the exam. However, she has figured out how to cheat and get a good grade. So, you being a good parent, you advise her not to cheat because what is the reason you give? I'd love to hear from some of you, either in the chat or if anybody wants to unmute. What is the reason you give your 10-year-old daughter not to cheat? Svetlana, we want to hear from you. You have a 10-year-old or 11 years old? How old is she?
Actually, yeah. There's twofold. One is the moral component.
Okay.
But the other side of it is we talk about how God gave her a big brain, and her job is to grow her brain and use her superpower for good, not for evil, and that's using it for evil, not for good.
Okay. I want to point out that both of your points kind of tie to the same point, which is that morally it's wrong to cheat. Right? So you're not tending to talk about practical sides of it. You're tending to talk more about the moral side of it. Okay, let's leave that for now, and let's try the second question. All right? So we're still on page 66. Your 8-year-old son tells you that he saw his friend's brother taking drugs. Sorry. Here we go. Your 8-year-old son tells you that he saw his friend's brother taking drugs. You figure this is a good time to discuss the topic. And by the way, the age could be debatable. Maybe 10 years old is the right age. Maybe 6 years old is the right age. That's fine. We're not really talking about the age right now. But let's assume you figure this is a good time to discuss the topic. You tell your child that he or she should stay away from drugs because. Anybody want to dive in here? Susie, go for it.
Yeah, because it hurts your body and your mind.
Okay. So in a certain way, you went almost the other way to what Svetlana said about the first case. You're saying, let's not talk about moral or theoretical concepts here. This is a very practical, dangerous thing that you can do to yourself. So don't do it to yourself, right? You're going the very practical route. Yes?
Yeah. I would drive through Skid Row.
Right, exactly. Show her imagery. By the way, you don't need to drive through Skid Row. You could just show her pictures, right? It's all
That's true.
online. All that sort of thing. Correct. And that could have a very, very good impact. Okay, like I said, there's no right or wrong answers here, but we're going to come back to this question later. We'll see if maybe we have more insight into how we would tweak those answers. Okay. Last week we started with a story of the previous Chabad Rebbe and how he was educated by his father, who was the previous Rebbe. We're going to do the same again this week. Because there's another story that really talks to this point. And again, it's going to start off being a very shocking story, and we might not agree with him. That's fine. And then we're going to try and explore it a little bit throughout the lesson. Matt or Beth, would you guys like to start off with reading? We're on page
Check 1, 2.
We're on page 60.
Can you hear me?
Next one. Yes, we hear you.
All right, great. When I was taught to recite Modeh Ani, I was taught to put my hands together, bow my head, and say Modeh Ani. When I was a little older, but still a young child, I asked my father, Rabbi Shalom Dovber, the 5th Chabad Lubavitch Rebbe.
1 second. Matt, let me interrupt you for just a second. I think there might be people on the Zoom or that are watching the recording that are not familiar with the Modeh Ani prayer. So Modeh Ani is the first prayer that a Jew says when we wake up in the morning. As soon as we wake up in the morning and we've been rejuvenated, there's a prayer we say. It's like a one-liner. Most Jews know it by heart. And it kind of just thanks God for giving us new energy and giving us our soul back in the morning so that we can now have a fresh day. Okay, go ahead.
Why, when we say Modeh Ani, do we put our hands together and bow our head? He answered me, we need to do as we were told without asking why. Oh. My father called over Rabbi Yosef Mordechai, his 80-year-old aide, and asked him, how do you say Modeh Ani in the morning? He replied, I put my hands together and bow my head. My father asked him further, why do you do it that way? Rabbi Yosef Mordechai answered, I don't know. When I was a small child, that's what I was taught to do. See, my father told me, he does it because that's what his father taught him. Before him was Moses and Abraham, the first Jew. We need to do without asking why. This is the embodiment of true education.
Okay, quite a story here. I want to point out that if the previous Rebbe is being, meaning the speaker here, if he's being taught to recite Modeh Ani, he is most likely around the age of 3, if not younger. Okay, so he's really, really young, and his father is telling him, you need to do without asking why. And he doesn't just suffice with saying, now's not time to talk about Modeh Ani. He makes a point of this. He brings over an 80-year-old who tells him he also doesn't know the answer why, and yet he does so without asking why. And the previous Rebbe, the child in this story, who is now grown and telling us the story, ends off by saying, again, as he did last week, this is the embodiment of true education. All right. And now my questions for you guys are, number one, what are the disadvantages of this style of parenting? Let's start with the disadvantages. Anybody?
Yes.
Rabbi, it's Beth. So my father used to tell the story that when his mother used to make a brisket, she would always cut off the end of the brisket. Do you know this one?
I do know this one, yes, but I want you to share with the class.
Okay. So she would always cut off the end of the brisket. And he said to his mother, why do you do that? She said, because my mother did it this way. And let's pretend that, so he went to his grandmother and he said, Grandma, why do you cut off the end of the brisket? She said, because my mother always cut the end of the brisket off. So lo and behold, after, going back as far as we could, he finds out, why did they cut off the end of the brisket? Because it was too big to fit in the pan.
And ever since then, every generation had been doing so. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, I think you were sharing the story also because it's humorous, but there's also a lesson from this story, which is we shouldn't just always do things just without asking why. So that would be one of the disadvantages of this style of parenting, is that that's how ridiculous things come into our family. That's how ridiculous notions come into our family. If we do things without asking why, we're teaching our children not to be curious, not to explore, etc. Right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, but I think that's one of the disadvantages to this style of parenting. What are some of the advantages to this style of parenting? And it's okay if there aren't any, but if there are, what do you think some of the advantages to this style of parenting are? Anyone?
Doctrinal conformity.
So that's an advantage to who?
The parent.
Right, to the parent, or maybe to the religion. I don't know
Yes.
that but we're asking if there's an advantage to this style of parenting, and by parenting we mean to the child. I think is there any advantage for the child?
If they need order, if they need order and structure, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I just got off the phone. I think it was yesterday with a good friend of mine that I know now for 10 years, and his daughter is struggling, and he's literally debating sending. I mean, by struggling, I mean really, really struggling, and he's debating sending her to a military school, because he really feels that that's what she's missing in her life: discipline and that sort of the order, like you said, like you put him at. Okay, so maybe that could be an advantage. Really, I think a question is, and that's the final question here on page 68, which I thought there was a slide for, but looks like there isn't. Is there? No. The third question is, can you think of times when you were asked a similar question, and how did you respond? And I love this question because every single parent has been asked this. No matter if your child is 2, or your child is 3, or your child is 18, you have all the time been asked the question, why? You've told them to do something, whatever it is, and you've been asked why. And I think the answer to how do we respond probably depends on what's been going on. If we've eaten, if we've slept, if we're in a good frame of mind, then maybe we use it as a teachable moment. Maybe we don't. Maybe we give a reason. Maybe we don't. But we do it. And it kind of varies along the spectrum. But one thing that's never going to go away is that question. Probably the question we are asked most often as parents is why. Even more often than what do I need to do now, right? What should I do now? Give me advice, is why. Why am I doing this? Why do you want me to do this? Why do you feel I should do this? Why is this the right thing to do? Why is this the wrong thing to do? Why are we Jewish? Why do we support Israel? Why do we have to ask please and thank you? Why do we, everything, the whole gamut. And the question we'd like to address today is, what is the proper way to handle this question? And it seems, at least at first glance, that the Rebbe Rashab, who we just quoted, is advocating a do it because I said so approach, right? Anybody raise your hand if you grew up with a parent like that? You asked why, and that's the answer you got, because I said so, right? Look, we could be possibly, I guess we could take the easy way out and just say that the Rebbe Rashab was maybe a product of his generation. Because if many of us are raising our hands that our parents said because I said so, and definitely our grandparents said that, and our great-grandparents for sure, as we go back, there was a lot more of an authoritarian parenting technique that was employed. So maybe the Rebbe Rashab was just advocating a parenting style that was popular in those days, and maybe that even worked for that generation. Maybe it doesn't work anymore. And I think that's some of the questions we're going to need to ask ourselves. Is this like a technique from the 1880s that we should be throwing out, or is it something we should be maintaining? And then obviously the last question is, even if we are throwing it out, should we be throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Is there maybe something that needs to be retained from it? Indeed, parents of today are certainly not the same as parents of a century ago. In fact, we as parents are very, very different from our own parents, even just one generation ago. And on page 69, we asked this question. But I think that we can break down the main things, that the main changes that have happened into just 3 things. 3 things that have mainly changed over the past generation or century, or over the past whatever it is, whether it's only 20 years or 50 years or whatever it is. Number 1 is concession. I think that many modern parents have a very, very difficult time saying no. And by the way, I don't even mean, even when we're not going to do our child's desire, we still have a difficult time saying no. In other words, many contemporary parenting experts discourage excessive use of that word because they're looking to get rid of the friction between the parent and the child. So even if, let's say, for example, you're about to sit down to dinner and the child wants to go out and play on their bicycle, many contemporary parenting experts would say, don't say, no, you cannot go play on your bicycle. Instead say, yes, you can go play on your bicycle after you've eaten dinner, right? And I think almost all of us are using techniques like this in order to avoid saying the word no. Even on a simple level, a teacher, most teachers in today's schools, if it's forbidden to run down the hallway and the child is zipping dangerously through the school hall, what do they say? Please walk, right? They don't say, don't run. They avoid saying that. And instead, we say, please walk. In short, as often as possible, we've been trying not to say no and instead to say yes. We're not judging this yet. We're not saying whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, but this is definitely the opposite approach of generations before, and just saying because I told you so. Another change that I think has happened in the last generation or two or three is the idea of choices. We and by the way, some advocate this even when you're trying to get your child to do a specific thing. They say, find a simple, stupid choice, right? We have to walk now. Would you like to walk or would you like to skip? Because we have to go from point A to point B. Would you like to walk or would you like to skip? Would you like to go here? Would you like to go there? But we need to leave here now. You know what I mean? Like, and a lot of parenting experts advocate this because in today's day and age, that really ties in with the general mode that society is in right now. We live in a world of choices. We go to the supermarket and we see a number, at least 10 choices for every single item that we want to buy. We come to Starbucks, and if we want to buy a coffee, there's 10 different options of what to buy. And even once you choose your option, there's usually like 3 sub options. You know what I mean? And we tend to offer our children the same decision making because we feel that it offers them a certain sense of freedom. Let's take a look at text 2, which is from Lori Gottlieb. It's the article in The Atlantic is titled "How to Land Your Kid in Therapy." Susie, you want to read it for us, please? Page 69.
Yeah. I never said to my son, here's your grilled cheese sandwich. I'd say, do you want the grilled cheese or the fish sticks? On a Saturday, I'd say, do you want to go to the park or the beach? Sometimes, if my preschooler was having a meltdown over the fact that they had to go to the grocery store, instead of swooping him up and wrestling him into the car, I'd give him a choice. Do you want to go to Trader Joe's or Ralph's? Once we got to the market, it was, do you want vanilla yogurt or peach? When I was my son's age, I didn't routinely get to choose my menu or where to go on the weekends, and the friends I asked say they didn't either. There was some negotiation, but not a lot, and we were content with that. We didn't expect so much, so it didn't bother us not to have it.
And this, I think, in a nutshell, summarizes the second difference that there is between the way we parent and the way parents of previous generation parented, which is that we give our children lots of choices. The third thing I want to talk about today that we've changed in the way we parent versus our parents, or versus, let's call it, generations prior, is that we are constantly explaining what we are doing to our children. I think we all have to accept that there's a huge gulf in intelligence, but also just in like knowledge, just simple knowledge and experience and maturity, whether it's intellectual or emotional, between us and our children, all parents and their children. And some parents try their hardest to bridge that gap by filling it up with explanations and justifications and mechanisms to bring their children up to speed with them and where they are. And every once in a while, by the way, they run into an issue because not everything is explainable to a child. Other parents, and I'm not suggesting that I'm just presenting right now the facts. I'm trying to remain neutral completely because other parents take the exact opposite approach, which to me also seems to have flaws in it, which is that they choose to not just maintain that gap, but kind of purposely keep it there. This is what you have to do. I know, I'm the parent, I know better. You are too young, you are too little to understand these things, and therefore you have to listen. And then, of course, there's the parents that are not quite sure what to do, right? One day they do like this, one day they do like that, etc. Right? I think that's where I find myself, at least. Every day I'm trying my best. When it comes to rules set by parents, children often want to know why. And sometimes it's a simple question of curiosity, like I think the story with the Rebbe was. But sometimes it's a challenge to the parent's authority, right? Why do I have to clean my room? Why do I have to come home by 11 p.m.? That's two different ages there, right there, right? Why must I do this and why may I not do that? Why can't I stay up all night, but you could stay up all night, right? All these different things. To summarize, I think when compared to the way previous generations handled all three of these types of areas of parenting, to concede or not to concede, to give children choices or not give them choices, to explain what's going on now or not explain it, we tend to be, I think the common denominator is that we tend to parent with less authority. We tend to try not to lay down the law, if you will. And instead we're trying to get our children to practice autonomy. And without a doubt, this is a byproduct of a larger societal shift, of which parenting is only actually a tiny piece of the puzzle. I see some of you nodding. As a society in general, over the past 100, 200 years, we've been overthrowing and rejecting many different forms of authority. And as a result, in parenting, we're adopting the same, by that I mean political and dictatorships, etc. And as a result, in parenting, we're applying those same freedoms, so to speak, and we're trading in the "cause I said so" for the children turning to the parents and saying, "You are not the boss of me." Right? So you can almost see the same dynamic as a king or a dictator or a czar or whoever it was telling his subjects, "Because I said so." And then now it works the exact opposite way, right? In today's free democracy, we turn to the police, we turn to the to our political leaders, and we say, "You're not the boss of me. I live in a free society." Let's take a look at text 3. Ben Sion, you want to read for us, please? We're on page 71.
So, ever tried any of these on your kids? Wait until your father gets home. Don't make me come in there. Or the famous, "You'll do it because I said so." Good work. If you're among the millions of parents whose kids don't exactly snap to attention, take heart. While these words may have peppered your own childhood and worked, there are some very real reasons they don't fly nowadays with your kids, no matter how many veins stick out in your forehead as you utter them. In fact, while demanding compliance may have gotten you and your siblings to listen up, nowadays will only push your own kids further away. You can thank some very positive societal shifts for your kids' refusal to jump into action when you bark orders. Just look around, and you'll see that cooperation rather than dominance is the new norm. This new order is why we see more pushback, power struggles, and negotiation than we ever have in past generations. You can blame on everything from C-SPAN to social media, but kids intuitively sense that everything's up for debate in the world around them. This leads them to respond to your best, "You'll do it because I said so," with, "You're the boss of me."
I think that Amy McCready really puts this very, very well. She says, even if you try to lay down the law with the same authoritarian perspective that your parents before you, or maybe if it's not parents, maybe it's grandparents or previous generations did, you're not even going to be successful. And the reason for that is because we live in a different society. We live in a different order. The world has changed, and therefore parenting has to change together with it. But as is always the case, there's good news and there's bad news. There are benefits and there are drawbacks to the fact that we no longer are as authoritarian in our parenting. And in learning exercise 2, on page 72, I'd like to encourage you each to try and put down some of the positive or negative results or reasons why we would or wouldn't want this parental authority being thrown out the window. Anybody want to suggest something? Maybe in the chat or unmute? Not all at once.
I have to know better what Kalman or Mackie want when they're older, so I can say this is leading to you becoming a teacher or something like that.
So you think that's a reason why the modern day lessening of parental authority is a positive thing?
I think so, versus being told like I should be a doctor, like my parents.
Okay, you know what, Miriam, why don't I challenge you? Because I think always we tend to form opinions and then we'd like start to side with one side. can I ask you, can you give me, think for a moment, can you give me a positive or sorry, a negative, why it's a bad idea that we've been lessening authority in today's day and age? Or do you think it's only positive?
Then you have to talk more about feelings. That's just hard. I have Asperger's. That's not my strength.
Okay. Anybody
Okay,
else?
should I step in then?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So in terms of negative, particularly from a religious point of view, we are a religion that teaches that God gave commandments. So how do you get kids to buy into this notion of they have to follow commandments from God if they're not willing to listen to their own parents?
So two things. First of all, let me just remind you what I told Matt Chevy at the beginning of the class. And maybe, I think you were still doing bedtime, so maybe you weren't here yet. But that seems to me like you're advocating that it's actually a negative thing for religion, but it's not a negative thing for children. Number one. Number two, my response, this is a totally different answer, but my response would be, how do you get children? No problem. Then they used to do it authoritarian. So same thing as everything else. They got children to eat healthy with authoritarian ways. Nobody is saying our children are not eating healthy. In the modern day and age, our children are also eating healthy, but we're using a different technique to get there, and that is explanations and concessions, and not using the word no, etc. So we would do the same thing with religion. It's not. It's. I don't know that it's any more or less difficult to have a child do religious things by explaining them to them constantly. Now, you could say that there's an element of religion that's not explainable, especially in Judaism. There's the chok element, right? But at least for 2/3 of the religion, if not more, 80% of the religion, you can explain Shabbos is such a good thing because of this, and then and have them come on board with Judaism because of that. But my question, so that's in terms of the religious aspect. But let's leave the religion out of here. I'm just asking: is it a negative thing that they no longer have authority in their life, or can we?
So something that another thing that I would throw in is this whole negotiating aspect essentially serves to reinforce sort of me. I'll do it if I want.
Ooh, now you're on to a point. So in other words, you're saying when we're continuing to explain things to children, we teach them that the world revolves around them. If I don't have an explanation, I don't do it. In other words, it's a very narcissistic approach. Is that where you were going?
Yes. There is no sense of that you are bound by tradition as a pact between the living, the dead, the living, and the unborn.
Thank you. So,
go ahead. I'm sorry. I wanted to add to what you're saying, with respect to parental authority. I intentionally parent my children completely different from the way my parents parented me and my siblings because of the outcome. I did not want the outcome. Not that everything is, squeaky clean and perfect, but
but I understand you're trying to avoid one specific result.
But what I found is that, like Miriam said just a minute ago, I felt I have fallen down the slippery slope of answering the why so many times that I've given up and I have become the permissive parent. Just do whatever you want.
Right, exactly. We overcorrect in that direction too much, and then maybe it's not sustainable. Okay. So you're giving another downside to it. I want to give a few other benefits, because I feel like we maybe, like, there was one benefit said, and then I said let's go to the negatives, and maybe we went too quickly to the negatives. Let me give some more benefits. First of all, I think that the authoritarian parenting, which of let's say 100 years ago, of previous generations, let's call it, lent itself much more to abuse. There's no question. I think every one of us here can testify, even maybe if we don't have a specific accounting, we can testify that it's a matter of fact that at least 50% of the time that our parents told us because I said so, it was not that they had a reason and didn't want to explain it to us, or they felt that we were too young to understand it. They actually didn't have a reason, or maybe it was actually a selfish reason, right? You have to go to bed now. Why? Because I said so. Between the lines, because I'm tired and I want to go to sleep and I'm not interested in you anymore, so you have to go to bed. Right. So in other words, it lent itself more to abuse. And that obviously was a bad moment, if you will, in the parenting in that situation. But I think that that's one of the benefits of changing the parenting not to be so authoritarian, is that it doesn't lend itself as much to abuse. right? By the way, and when I say abuse, I've actually been using it in the more looser sense of the word. In other words, just using it when it's not necessary. But let's use it in the more literal sense of the word. If you go back enough generations, we're talking about physical abuse. Anytime a child didn't want to do something, there was a waving of a belt, right? That definitely led to abuse, and as we know, that can lead to other psychological or traumatic issues, etc. So that's another benefit. And I think another benefit to the modern day lessening of parental authority is that we respect children more. Maybe it's the same idea as what I'm saying, just the flip side, but we tend to think about the child more. If you're constantly explaining things to the child, if you're constantly making concessions to the child, if you're constantly giving the child choices, putting the child in control, so you're being much more sensitive to the child. It's much more child-led parenting. So these are some of the benefits as to why. I mean, by the way, this is to say nothing about the fact that some of the rules that were laid down were simply unfair. I mean, they were just backward, right? Like some of the rules that we've gotten rid of from previous generations are just amazing. Like remember in lesson 1 when we spoke about how in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, I forget when, children were the property of their parents. I think we're all very happy that type of authoritarianism is gone, right? In parenting, it's just simply fairer and less backward. But I think now it's time to talk about some of the downsides to it. And text 4a really starts to talk about narcissism. This idea that Bizi Ben Sion brought up, I see it's not on the screen, but that he brought up first, which we're now going to talk about, which is this idea that the moment you make everything about the child, you are subconsciously, subliminally sending a message that everything revolves around you. Svetlana, would you like to read for us, please? We're on page 73, text 4a. This is from the new Greatest Generation from Time Magazine by Joel Stein.
Yes. Here's the cold, hard data. The incidence of narcissistic personality disorder is nearly 3 times as high for people in their 20s as for the generation that is now 65 or older, according to the National Institute of Health. 58% more college students scored higher on a narcissism scale in 2009 than in 1982. Millennials got so many participation trophies growing up that a recent study showed 40% believed they should be promoted every 2 years, regardless of performance. They are fame obsessed. 3 times as many middle school girls want to grow up to be a personal assistant to a famous person as want to be a senator, according to a 2007 survey. 4 times as many would pick the assistant job over CEO of a major corporation. Millennials consist, depending on whom you ask, of people born from 1980 to 2000. In the US, millennials are the children of baby boomers, who are also known as the me generation, who then produce the me generation.
So one of the downsides that Joel Stein is pointing out, and I think Beasley hit the nail on the head as soon as he started to think about the downsides of getting rid of all authoritarianism in our lives, means that in our children's lives, means that we're telling them everything is you led, and there's this sub message that if everything is about my choices, if everything is about my understanding and the explanations to me, etc., so then what's left is everything must revolve around me. And as they grow up, we're actually seeing this data playing out. That's why they're much more fame obsessed. That's why they refuse to take responsibility. That's why they make narcissism seems to be a big issue. Now, what happens when someone is extremely narcissistic? The next thing on the line, and Svetlana, if you can continue for us, this is the same text here, text 4b. The next thing that pops up as direct result of being so narcissistic is entitlement. Go ahead.
I got to turn the page.
Page 74, sorry.
My cat won't let me. Okay, text 4b. What millennials are most famous for besides narcissism is its effect, entitlement. If you want to sell seminars to middle managers, make them about how to deal with young employees who email the CEO directly and beg off projects they find boring.
Right, so the next step of narcissism, if you're so narcissistic, and stay with us, Svetlana, hold on, you're going to keep reading, it's a long text. If you're narcissistic, the next thing that happens is entitlement. If the world revolves around me, then if I want this job, or if I don't want to do this job, I just appeal directly to the CEO. Please don't make me do this job. right? There's no sense of responsibility. There's a sense of entitlement. Okay. And the real problem of entitlement is that if the world revolves around me and I am entitled to everyone's respect and deference, now, if let's say I come up against something that may or may not be wrong, right? What happens? All of a sudden, we have what I would consider the biggest issue of all, which is moral subjectivity. If the whole world revolves around me, if I'm entitled to everything, so then now if we want to know, can I drink this or can I not drink this? Can I do this or can I not do this? Can I steal this? Can I not steal this? The main question is, what do I feel about it? Let's see, text 4c.
They're so convinced of their own greatness that the National Study of Youth and Religion found the guiding morality of 60% of millennials in any situation is that they'll just be able to feel what's right.
So rather than be guided by an authority, they don't want to accept religion, right? And I think this is a point that BZ spoke to earlier, that Matt spoke to earlier as well, right? That it's harder to get them to submit to a religion. Why? Because to them, everything revolves around me. Morality should also revolve around me. It should revolve around what I feel is right and what I feel is wrong. And the only word that's repeating itself over and over in those two sentences is "I feel," right? That's the only common denominator. Is it right or right or wrong to walk out on a person's spouse in favor of a prettier face? How do I feel about it? Well, in this instance, I feel like it's right. In this instance, I feel like it's wrong, right? And that becomes a big issue. And this also leads to the last point that we're going to make in text 4D, which is disrespect for workplace hierarchy. Svetlana, if you can finish off for us, please. Page 75.
Yes, they appear to be cocky. They believe that they offer something valuable. Raised by parents are like peers, they've always had a say. 66% of millennials believe my boss could learn a lot from me. 65% say I should be mentoring older coworkers when it comes to tech and getting things done. This doesn't mean they don't think they have a lot to learn from their boss. It's a sense that learning is a two-way street, regardless of seniority.
And I think we could sum up everything we've said until now with the following. The reality is that life is not going to give us it's not always going to give us what we want and the way we want it and when we want it, or even in any way that makes sense to us. We've all had that experience as parents. As adults, we all know that, right? We have to accept certain things no matter what. But if children are brought up without any sense of that kind of reality, why? Because they're constantly being catered to, they're constantly being allowed to do what they want, and they're constantly being given choices. And if it's something that they are being told what to do, they're given an explanation, then they lose that skill. In other words, as a society, we would, if we're using those type of techniques, we would not be doing a good job preparing our children for the world. Okay, but up until now, we've been talking strictly societal. This is a bad idea societally or socially because it's not going to be for the real world. But actually, from a Jewish perspective, it's not just that practically it's not going to work. It's also there's a theological issue with it. Gracie, do you have your book with you? I know you just arrived. On page 75, we have text 5. Which is from when the Jewish people accepted Torah.
Okay. Moses came from atop Mount Sinai and told the nation all of God's words. The people responded, all the commands that God spoke, we will do and we will understand.
Right? And famously, first we will do and then we will understand. We first accepted God's authority and rules without question. I try to do this anytime I do any mitzvah with anybody. If I put on tefillin with them, or if I have them, whatever it is, right? If I'm doing a mitzvah with someone, and they ask me why, I usually say, listen, 2 reasons. Number 1, God said so. Number 2, this is the significance of the reason, etc. Right? But there is an element that every single mitzvah entails, which is the nasa element. Nasa came before nishma. Nasa means to do. Nishma means to listen and understand what the reason is behind what we're doing. Right? And from when our people accepted the Torah, we always preceded the acceptance of authority from God before the mitzvah, the actual, I'm sorry, before the detailed explanation for this particular mitzvah. And I think we have to ask ourselves, would we be able to say the same today? Would we even want to say the same today? First I'll do and then I'll understand. Put our intellect on the side for a moment and just accept what God wants. And would our children be able to do that? Would we even want our children to be able to do that? So I think we're left to the conundrum. I've tried to really beef up both sides, and hopefully you're with me here, that there's really a lot of pros and cons on both sides. And we're left with this conundrum. It seems that imposing authority upon children has both value and drawbacks. And I guess my question is, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to find a proper balance, right? Or is authority maybe like being half pregnant? You know, you can't have half authority. Either you're laying down the law, or you're not, right? Is there even such a thing as finding a balance between how much authority to have? And the answer, my friends, is that from a Jewish perspective, there are two types of authorities. There is positive authority. There's a good authority that Judaism not only embraces, but actually requires in our parenting. And then there is a negative type of authority, which Judaism completely and utterly rejects in our parenting. Okay? I think the biggest problem that most of us have with authority is that historically it's been used and abused by those in a position of power to control and oppress those that were not in a position of power. The risk of sounding exhaustive, I'm now going to list about 10 of them. Are you ready? Men who were physically and more power, or physically the more powerful gender, used and abused their power over women, right? The well-armed and technologically superior nations, think, for example, the colonial Europeans, right, imposed their authority on Native Americans, or as well as the inhabitants of Africa and India, etc., right? The wealthy always imposed their authority on the poor. The politically well-connected always imposed their authority. They used their power to subjugate those that were less politically connected. Slave owners over slaves, armed tyrants over unarmed civilians. In all of these instances, the motivation behind the authority was the benefit of the more powerful authority, the benefit of the more powerful party. In other words, there were two parties here. One was more powerful, or one had more authority, let's call it. It's not always more powerful, right? Sometimes it's positions, whatever it is. And they used that in order to benefit themselves. In other words, authority is of this sort, I guess we could call it like getting drunk, right? There's this phrase, drunk on power, right? It tends to aggravate or to exaggerate certain selfish tendencies that the one in power has. And that type of authority, from a Torah perspective, is utterly and completely morally reprehensible. Let's take a look at text 6a. By the way, this is a personal pet peeve of mine for those that are interested. There are reformists and apologists about the Torah who like to call the Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim a caste system. This is usually secular scholars. It's usually not people who read a lot of Torah commentary, but just text 6a, which comes directly from the Torah, should throw that right out the window. And this is the type of authority that Judaism rejects. Where are we holding here? I guess, Beth, if you can read for us, please.
I'm going to tap in on her behalf.
You got it. Text 6a, page 76.
Yes. One law applies to the entire assembly, both you and the foreigner. This shall be an eternal rule for your future generations. You and the foreigner are equal before God. There shall be one Torah and one law for you and the foreigner who resides with you.
The Torah, in its truth, is telling us straight up that Torah law is supposed to be equal to everyone. Numerous times in the Torah, we are taught to treat certain classes of people with great sensitivity and respect, but never, heaven forbid, to oppress or harass them. For example, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, right? But even though that's the case, this was only in order to make sure that their they were naturally in a position where they can be taken advantage of, but that's just in order to make sure they're treated equally, never to raise them above someone else, and never to raise someone else above them. When it comes to Jewish courts of law, you have to take a look. This is fascinating stuff. I'm going to link in the follow-up email. Let me write it down as I don't forget. The laws of the Rambam of Maimonides when it comes to a bet din, the laws of what has to happen when a person comes to a bet din. So, for example, if a king is being judged, he has to be on the same level as the regular person. He has to be wearing the same clothing as the regular person. If a great Torah scholar is being judged, they have to be treated equally, etc. Now, I want to make something clear. I'm not suggesting here that Jews always adhere to these laws. There were definitely times in history, just like in secular history, where Jews took advantage of their position of power, their political position, or the fact they were the king, and I would say they didn't just use to take advantage, they abused against the will of the Torah, their position of power to actually go against the Torah and to subjugate others. That's certainly not fine. It's certainly not okay. But my point is that from a Torah perspective, everyone is supposed to be equal under the law. And in fact, I think BZ Chin was at that course. I'm looking for anybody else, maybe Matt Shebby. There was a course I gave, I think it was the last course before COVID. So let's say winter of 2020, it was called Judaism's Gifts to the World. And one of the gifts that Judaism gave to the world, believe it or not, is equality. Let's take a look at text 6b. BZ, in fact, I'll ask you to read it, please, for us. It's from Paul Johnson's A History of the Jews, page 76. Go ahead.
So from Paul Johnson, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. Humanity might have eventually stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. To them, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of a human person.
Thank you, BZ. And it's this type of authority that the Torah absolutely rejects, and that thankfully has been steadily waning on the global scale. Now, because it's been steadily waning, what happens is we may have been throwing out the baby with the bathwater by actually getting rid of all authority from our lives as a result of all of this democracy and freedom and equality and liberty and what's the other one? Egalitarianism, right? Equality, liberté, right? Maybe I mixed up the order. In other words, just because so let's stick to the Jewish perspective here. Just because Judaism rejects abuse of power, it does not mean that Judaism doesn't recognize that there is certain power, that there is certain authority that is actually required in a person's life. There's a point of departure, I think, right here, right where we are right now, for Judaism from Western culture. Judaism's primary document, I love to point this out to people because this is one symptom of the entire departure here between Judaism and Western values as they are today in 2024. Judaism's primary document, which is the Torah, consists of a series of obligations, do's and don'ts. Okay? There is not a lot of talk in the Torah about rights. My right to be happy, my right to be religious, my right to be this, my right to live here, my right to own land. There's not a lot of talk about it in the Torah. It does exist. Verse 16 from Numbers 15 that we just read, text 6a, is one example of it. There's a few times, but primarily the Torah is a book of obligations, not of rights. Western thought, and let's take the U.S. as an example, so the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, primarily, they talk about the glorious gift to modern humanity, which is man's unalienable rights. It's all about rights. My right to this, my right to that. We have to protect rights, civil rights, human rights, gender rights, religious rights, all sorts of rights, freedoms, rights, abilities, my right to be X, Y, or Z. The reason for this, I would say, is a little bit of an overcorrection. Why? Because, and I'm not saying it's a bad overcorrection, by the way. I'm not saying it's a bad overcorrection. I don't know that necessarily we need more authority from government in our lives. I'll leave that to the Republicans, the Democrats to have this conversation. I'm not going to get involved politically here. But I think in our personal lives is where we're looking for more authority, where it's a little bit of an overcorrection. In other words, they were running from, let them eat cake. They were running from, there's a French Revolution. They were running from aristocracy being in control, the church being in control, kings and queens and dictatorships, czars and czaras and czarinas and all this. That's what they were looking to run away from. So while both Judaism and the US Constitution, let's go back to where they are together, assure us that everybody has rights, what happens is Western culture turns that into the basis of everything we do. It revolves around our rights. Whereas Judaism says, no, everything revolves around our obligations. Even our freedoms, even our rights, even our equalities are all revolved around our obligations. Now, to be sure, America is an amazing country. The Rebbe called it over and over again, a Medina shel Chesed, a country of kindness. I don't know that there's ever been a time for our people, a country that for our people has been more kind and inclusive and tolerable to our people than America has been. And it served us very well. But I think it has its drawbacks in terms of the lack of authority. And I think this basic Jewish value is something that we should look to teach our children. That's really where I'd like to get to. Why? Because think about it. Which one, an overstress of obligations or an overstress of rights, is going to lead to more narcissistic children? We already spoke about the detriments, the drawbacks of narcissism before. Which one is going to lead to it? Obviously, the more we stress a person's rights and we make their whole life revolve around, these are my rights, this is what I get to do, that's going to lead to a more narcissistic perspective. Judaism has a value, and in Hebrew we call it Kabbalat Ol. Susie, if you can read for us, please. We're going to read now from the Zohar, the Holy Zohar. Text 7 on page 77.
We place a yoke upon an axe while it is still young, so that it should bring benefit to the world. If, however, the ox does not accept the yoke, it will not be productive. So too, a human must accept the yoke from the beginning, and then he can serve God and as is required. If, however, he does not accept the yoke from the beginning, he is unable to serve. This is the meaning of the verse, serve God with awe.
This is the type of authority that we're looking to, that Judaism embraces, that every person should have, we should have in our lives, and that actually we should impart to our children. In other words, this ability, and I want to point out, by the way, the Hebrew term for it, Kabbalat Ol means acceptance of a yoke, all right? And I remember when we were in yeshiva, they used to stress us the importance of not just looking at it, it's not just a yoke. They don't just talk about the yoke of heaven that's put on you, the yoke of heaven it's the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. So we're still rejecting someone else coming, another human being coming and forcing a yoke on you. But we, in our own lives, and we have to teach our children from when they're very young to accept upon themselves an authority. And in this instance, it's the authority of Judaism or the authority of God. And this is not just beneficial religiously, as Matt and BZ would be quick to point out, I think. It's also beneficial even just societally. Why? Because when we realize that it's not just about us, we live for something higher, we live for something different, then actually our lives are greatly enhanced. We're not going to have time for it, but there's an appendix at the end, Appendix A, which I highly recommend. It's a story, it's another story about one of the Rebbes, and it's about how one of the Rebbes hired a teacher, who fired a teacher because the teacher was skipping over, was teaching very young children, and he was skipping over the stories about miracles. And he stressed to him that actually miracles are one of the most important things to teach children when they're younger. Why? Because it stresses this idea that we don't understand everything. It's not all understandable to me. And that's fine. That's okay. That's not a problem. That's not something to run away from. I need to be able to accept some sort of authority in my life that's higher than me. Okay. In one of the previous texts, we read that the millennial generation started, right? The millennial generation, which is the first generation that struggles with this me issue. It was text 4a. We said it started in the year 1980. It's wild. 1980, 81 is also the year that the Rebbe founded something called Tzivot Hashem. Okay, Tzivot Hashem is the Chabad approach to education. It is a global youth organization open to all Jewish boys and girls. I'll send out a link if you'd like to register your children. It's only open to children under the age of 12 or 13, under bar or bat mitzvah. All right. And what was the name that the Rebbe chose to give this organization? He called it Tzivot Hashem, the Army of God. What's the goal of this organization? To encourage children to do more mitzvahs, to make programs, publications, to increase their Jewish identity, provide with Jewish education through fun, informal programs, publications, personal encounters, meetups, all the typical type of stuff in a children's program. But what was the name that the Rebbe chose to call this program? It was called Tzivot Hashem, God's Army. And from the moment that the Rebbe introduced this, the Rebbe spoke, to the best of my understanding, he's the only Jewish leader who routinely spoke to children. He would gather all the children in 770. No adults were allowed in except for their teachers, guardians, whoever was taking care of them, whether it was a school function or a camp function, whatever it was. And the Rebbe would talk to them. And when the Rebbe would talk to them, from 1980 and on, what happened? All of the language the Rebbe used with them was Tzivot Hashem language, Army of God. You are soldiers in the Army of God. You can progress to become sergeants, to become lieutenants, to become generals, etc. There's an order of the day, and that's all of it was just to encourage mitzvah, to encourage good behavior, to encourage listening to your parents, etc. But all cloaked in this language of the commander-in-chief is God, and we have to listen to the commander-in-chief. We have to use tactics against the Yetzer Hara, military language. Sure enough, about a year or two later, shortly after the organization is founded, the Rebbe receives a letter from an educator, and it contains strong critique. He's like, seriously, this is what children need? Militaries, that was the only theme you could think of? You couldn't think of a mileage reward program or something, Military is what you went with? This is what children need. The militaries have violence and all sorts of other things. This is what you had to use. And in his response, the Rebbe begins, first of all, by saying that it's not a foreign concept. The Jewish people are called the Army of God in the Torah when they leave Egypt. But actually, the Rebbe does much more. So let's turn our attention to the video screens. We're going to be watching now. I'm a little embarrassed. This is a video production that it's a portion of a video production that was played 6 years ago at my son Menachem's Pidyon Haben. My wife and I put it together. And as part of it, we wanted to talk about Tzivot Hashem, and we quoted a little bit from this letter. So I'm the narrator, and my voice is also like my 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning voice. I was a fresh parent, no sleep, So please, I'm a little embarrassed of my voice, so don't judge me here. Anyways, please turn your attention to the videos because I think it'll set the tone for this Tzivot Hashem, and then we'll read the letter itself. Oh, whoops, sorry. Let us fast forward to the month of Tishrei, 1981. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, ever caring for every Jew, no matter their background or age, sensed a growing issue among American youth. In the Rebbe's words, this is a quote from American children are being brought up on the spirit of independence and freedom, and on the glorification of personal prowess and smartness. It has cultivated a sense of cockiness and self-assurance to the extent that one who is bent on mischief or antisocial activity feels that one can outsmart a cop on the beat and even a judge on the bench, and in any event, there is little to fear in the way of punishment. In other words, Jewish children were missing a sense of purpose and obedience to a higher calling. That year, the Rebbe founded a movement he called Tzivos Hashem, God's Army.
Sollen sich aufführen, sagt man auf der Ruf, aber wie bald am Zed wie der Eberster hat eingestellt, an der Armee fühlt sich da, zwischen Menschen ist das der Fall, was er sehr viel darf sich fühlen, der Eberstens Armee, was Armee hält sich auf dem, zum alle Mächten, a jeder ish sova, jeder soldier weiß, a das an ernste Sache, das ist a gesunde Sache und a glückliche Sache und a freiliche Sache, aber mir basitzer dazu mit Ernstkeit, mir vergesst nicht, an mir gehört zu Zova Hashem.
Today, Tzivos Hashem functions as a worldwide movement, with over 1 million soldiers receiving their orders from the Commander-in-Chief, God, via the Torah, instilling within them a sense of purpose and awareness of their role in this world. So the Rebbe writes this letter to this educator who's challenging this concept. And Svetlana, it's a little bit long. By the way, the letter is much longer. I'm going to link the full letter. Let me write this down so I don't forget. But text 8 is an excerpt from it that I think stresses this importance of having positive authority in your life. Self-accepted authority, but a positive authority in your life. Go ahead, text 8.
Okay. As an educator, you know that children need motivation, but that is only one aspect of the problem. The most important aspect, in my opinion, in this day and age is the lack of Kabbalas, acceptance of the yoke, not only of Ol Malchus. Okay, I apologize.
Shamayim.
Thank you. The yoke of the sovereignty of heaven, but also general insubmission to authority, including the authority of parents at home and of teachers in school, and the authority of law and order in the street. There remains only the fear of punishment as a deterrent. But that fear has been reduced to a minimum because there has, in recent years, been what amounts to a breakdown of law enforcement for reasons which need not be discussed here. On the other hand, American children have been brought up on the spirit of independence and freedom, and on the glorification of personal prowess and smartness. It has cultivated a sense of cockiness and self-assurance to the extent that one who is bent on mischief or antisocial activity feels that one can outsmart a cop on the beat, even a judge on the bench, and, in any event, there is little to fear in the way of punishment. As with every health problem, physical, mental, or spiritual, the cure lies not in treating the symptoms, but in attacking the cause, although the former may sometimes be necessary for the relief in acute cases. Since, as mentioned, the root of the problem is the lack of Kabbalas Ol, I thought long and hard about finding a way of inducing an American child to get used to the idea of subordination to a higher authority, despite all the influence to the contrary. In the school, in the street, and even at home, where parents, not wishing to be bothered by their children, have all too often abdicated their authority and left it to others to deal with truancy, juvenile delinquency, etc. I came to the conclusion that there was no other way than trying to effect a basic change in the nature through a system of discipline and obedience to rules which he can be introduced to get accustomed to. Moreover, for this method to be effective, it would be necessary that it should be freely and readily accepted without coercion. Thus, a pilot, Tzivos Hashem, was instituted. It immediately proved a great success in getting children to do good things in keeping with the motto,
Okay,
thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, coupled with love and obedience to the commander-in-chief of Tzivos Hashem, namely Hashem Elokei Tzivos, the God of hosts.
There's a couple of things I want to point out here. I mean, I find this letter to be brilliant. I was introduced to this letter about 15 years ago, and I found it to be like beyond brilliant. The Rebbe's insight here into the fact that this is in 1980, that there's a spirit of lack of authority and lack of obedience, and it's coming from larger societal waves, which are actually good things, but it's having a negative impact on parenting, is so spot on. And let me point out a few small things here. Number one, I love the line in the third to last paragraph where the Rebbe says that all the influences, the school, the street, even at home, was parents. So the line that Rebbe throws in there is so true. Parents would like to believe, oh, I'm just being nicer to my children. But the true motive of it is often because they don't wish to be bothered by their children. They're lazy. and therefore they abdicate their authority. It turns out being authoritarian is harder. Having some sort of authority over your children's life is harder than being a permissive parent. Not easier. It's easier to just say, and I think Svetlana spoke to this earlier in today's lesson, where it started off she wants to educate her child and explain everything to her child, and then it just becomes, you know what, I don't have patience, forget it, do whatever you want, right? Which obviously is laziness and obviously is not what's, I apologize, Svetlana, if I'm using you as a negative example here, but obviously that's not in the child's best interest, right? And yet we cloak it sometimes in, yeah, but I'm being more sensitive to the child and explaining things to the child. Maybe that's not what the child wants from you. Maybe that's not what the child needs from you. Maybe what the child needs from you is a little bit of authority. Not even from you. They need you to teach them authority. Anyways, another line that I thought is so important, and I spoke about this earlier, the fact that in Hebrew this is called Kabbalat Ol, right? Which means accepting the yoke. It's not just the yoke of heaven from God, etc., but actually the person themselves, the child themselves, has to accept that authority. And that's the last line of the second to last paragraph. Moreover, for this method to be effective, it would be necessary that it should be freely and readily accepted without coercion. Positive authority doesn't come from somebody else forcing it on you. It comes from somebody modeling it for you and them showing you how they've accepted authority in their lives. You should accept authority in your life. Anyways, but I think the main point we're making here is that there are two types of authority. There's a positive authority. There's a negative authority. Authority that is someone taking taking advantage or abusing power that they have over someone else, which could be in parenting, could be very, very detrimental. I would say every abusive parent, whether physically abusive, sexually abusive, emotionally abusive, verbally abusive, any one of them is a parent using their authority in an abusive manner. They're just saying, I'm more powerful over you, so therefore you have to listen to me, right? And by the way, probably the biggest telltale sign of that would be whether they're in line with lesson 1. Is it self-driven? Is it ego-driven? I say they as if it's like these are the bad, abusive parents. I'm talking to us. We can sometimes be using our authority in a negative way and sometimes be using our authority in a positive way, right? And the telltale sign is going to be, do you have your own best interest at heart? I'm tired now. I haven't eaten. I'm not in the mood of my children. Or is it my child's best interest at heart, right? And then there's positive authority, which is ideally accepted by the child on their own, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, how we can do that, how we can teach our children to actually accept authority on their own. But even if it's taught by a parent, it's taught by enforcing rules, ideally from the Torah, but accepting a higher power and a higher responsibility in our lives. So it turns out that the solution to authority is not finding a balance between good authority and bad authority. It's actually just sifting through them. It's completely eliminating the negative type of authority and embracing and reinforcing the positive type of authority. In other words, you can't be half pregnant. You need to be fully pregnant, but with the right child. Okay. Maybe that analogy didn't carry all the way through, but that's okay. So we now know what the goal is, right? But I think right about now, most of you should be thinking, okay, I'm on board. Rabbi Joshi, I get it. You're explaining Judaism's perspective on authority, and I'm on board that I like it. I think it's a good thing. But how on earth do you get there? Like, how do you teach this to a 2-year-old? How do you teach this to a 4-year-old? How do you teach this to a 15-year-old? Right? It doesn't look like because I said so. That's negative authority. That's a parent abusing their position of power and just saying something because they're not in the mood of their children, right? So we have to try to answer these two questions on page 80, these two practical, what are the practical do's and don'ts that come out of this, right? So we have two questions, and we're going to try to fill in these blanks. In order to enhance my child's sense of an appreciation for responsibility, for duty, for authority, right? I should or I should not do X, Y, or Z. And then if I want to minimize my unhealthy authority, remember there's good authority and bad authority. If I want to increase good authority, what can I do? And if I want to decrease unhealthy authority, what can I do that I exert on my child? What can I do? So let's go through some answers to these questions. I think probably first and foremost, and I mentioned this in passing earlier, in order to enhance our child's sense of an appreciation for responsibility or authority in their lives, if we want to have a healthy sense of authority, it needs to be self-accepted. And the best way to get a child to self-accept something is for us to do it. When we model it, then the child himself does it. Beth, can you read for us, please? Beth or Matt, one of you. If you can read for us, please, text 9 on page 81, which is from Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch.
Why is it so difficult for parents to instill within their children the foundational value of accepting authority of their own volition? Perhaps the true reason is that acceptance of authority may be the only value that children don't see exemplified by their parents, for we tend to relate to our children as commanders and instructors. From whence then shall they learn the importance of subordination? Jewish parents, however, have the advantage of leading a Jewish way of life, which is infused and suffused with subservience. We freely choose to submit to God's commandments and accept them as the foundation of our value system. Doing so brings us great joy. In the eyes of a child, the Torah constitutes the parents of his or her parents. The joy that the parents take in subordinating themselves to Torah and its instructions is a wonderful model for the child to emulate.
Thank you, Matt. Do you know how powerful it is if you are in your parents' house, right? And there's two options here. Your children can see you finally finished being frustrated with your parents, being your parents, telling you what to do, etc. You screaming, don't tell me what to do, don't tell me how to parent my child. Or they can watch you be submissive to your parents. They can watch you accept the authority of your parents. Now, I understand that depends on the relationship of everybody with their parents. It might not be easy, right? But you can actually do this on all sorts of levels, even not with parents. For example, imagine how powerful it is to your child to see you collapsed on the couch saying, I really don't want to clean the dinner table now, but I know that that's the right thing to do. I know the dinner table needs to be cleaned, so I'm going to get up and I'm going to clean the dinner table. And you get up and you do that. I know that, for them to watch you be in a position, which is usually your hardest moment, your weakest moment. And we're all into showing our children our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities, etc. I'm not saying that, but here's the thing. For us for our children to watch us accept authority upon ourselves, go through the motions of Kabbalat Ol, accepting the yoke, whatever it is. And there's nothing wrong with telling our children we are doing something that we don't want to do. Okay? It's snowing outside, but we go to shul every Shabbos, right? And your child says, I don't want to go to shul this Shabbos. You say, you know what? I don't want to go to shul either. You think I want to walk outside in the snow? But to me, this is important. I am going to do it. Right? One of my favorite examples is, mainly because this is like the classic parenting meltdown experience. And I feel like I have something really to offer people here, like an insight to offer people here. What is the worst part of grocery shopping? Anybody want to type it in the chat? We all know. What is the worst part of grocery shopping with your children? In general, the whole grocery shopping experience is engineered. We're being like psychologically engineered by the people who set up the grocery store, right? They put this in the front and this there, etc. What's the worst moment though? Very good. Paying, checkout. Thank you, all those that message me. Why? Because by the checkout is where they put all of the things that they know your children want, and you're forced to stand there for 5 minutes, for 8 minutes, for 2 minutes, depending if it's Trader Joe's or Ralph's. You know how it works, right? And your children want everything. Well, let me tell you something, folks. I don't struggle with this. You know why? What do you think happens when my child tells me I want that candy? My reaction is, I'm sorry, Menachem, I would love to get it for you, but it's not kosher. And you know what happens? It's so interesting. They just all of a sudden shut up. There's not a single other word about it, because somehow they are aware that kosher is a line. But folks, it's worth to keep kosher just for this. They are aware that this is a line that we don't cross. Now, by the way, it doesn't work to lie. It doesn't work to lie. I've heard of parents that have tried this. They go to a kosher store and then they see whatever, or they go to a non-kosher store and they see a candy and their child says, I want this. And they say it's not kosher. Eventually your kids catch on. They catch you, they catch on that it is kosher, or and it doesn't work. It only works if it's true. And what happened, never mind the fact that it's such bad parenting to be modeling lying and cheating and using things for your convenience for your children. But leaving all that aside, what happens is, I don't understand, why do they get quiet? Because it's not kosher, they don't want it. They still want it just as bad. But they are aware of the fact that there is a higher authority that we are both subscribing to, and that's it. It's off the table. Shabbos is the same way, right? I want to drive here. I want to do this, etc. Do they ask me? As the younger children they are, they do ask. As they get older, they don't ask anymore. That's it. These are the rules. This is the fact. And by the way, in the areas in my personal parenting that I've actually laid down the law that way, it works. It really, really works. One example that we have in our parenting is, there's the whole, as soon as children get into their bed, for some reason, that's when they get very, very hungry and very, very thirsty, right? So in our family, we have a rule. In your bed, you're only allowed to have one of two things. You can have rice cakes, which probably was a little bit of a bad idea, or an apple. Those are the only two things. If you're hungry, that's what you can have. There's nothing else. And then they have their sippy cup next to them for drinking, right? And in the beginning, when we put down this rule, they tried to play with it a little bit. Eventually, it became the rule. They've never asked again. They've never said, oh, I want some more dinner. I want this. It's not an option. This is where we are. This is the authority of acceptance, and that's that. I say this because I think that there's something very powerful for children seeing us subscribing to those same rules, or the rice cake and apples, leave that aside. But with kosher, they know that they're modeling my behavior. To me, kosher is off the table. To them, to me, non-kosher is off the table. To them, non-kosher is off the table. And you know how amazing this is for adults? There was a study that was done. I don't remember enough of it, so I can't really quote it, but it was basically about religious people that are addicted smokers. In Israel, they did a study that somehow on Shabbos, they don't have cravings to smoke. Isn't that interesting? The whole week, and I know what this study was. They tried to get them to make another day of the week like Shabbos. Thursday, for 24 hours, you don't smoke. None of them were able to hold out. But for some reason, Shabbos, when religion is involved, when their acceptance of a higher authority is involved, they were able to sustain it. It's an amazing thing. Why? Because it's a tool, it's a value, it's something that children need in their lives, and when we model it for them, we can actually teach them this value. I think another way is something not to do is we shouldn't always be explaining everything to our children. Explaining things to our children is good. There are moments to explain things to our children, but maybe not always. Maybe every once in a while we can choose those moments, and it should probably be moments that we know 100% that I'm doing this for the child's good. And I'm not going to explain it. And you can even say to yourself, the reason I'm not explaining this one to my child is because I need that there should be some times that there's no answer. That's it. We're just not doing it because we're not doing it. Not everything needs to be explained, right? And by the way, whatever, we don't have enough time now to take everybody's perspective on this, but the exercise that we did at the beginning of the class, remember that exercise? Why is cheating wrong? Why is drugs wrong? Look, if it's the right time to explain it and to sit and have a conversation about it, we could do that. No problem. But sometimes what we can tell our children is, right now we're discussing drugs. Drugs is wrong because drugs are wrong, and that's it. That's it. No why, no because, it just is. And if we want to, later on, a different opportunity when it's not in the moment, we can explain to them what's wrong with drugs. We can take them for a trip to Skid Row. We can do whatever we do with them. But maybe there's some value in certain things just being off the table, period. Just because I think this is a very delicate point, I want to make sure I'm stressing. This certainly does not mean that we shouldn't ever explain things to our children. Of course, we are teachers, we are parents. We have to be teaching our children about what's right and what's wrong in the world, and there's lots of room for lots of conversations to educate our children. But we also have to be communicating to them this extremely important value of accepting authority, of Kabbalat Ol, of being able to do something just because that's the right or that's the wrong thing. I think probably. Right, so we spoke of role modeling, we spoke of not always explaining. I think we spoke enough about removing the ego, that's a big part of making sure to get it right. And then I think this last point is something that, especially when we're talking about authority, we need to make sure to talk about, which is it should never be personal. It's never the right time to be being authoritarian with your child if there's something personal on the line. I should not be making myself the issue of authority or the issue of you listen to me or you don't listen to me, etc. And here too, Rabbi Shamshon Fall Hirsch has some insight. Gracie, you want to read it for us, please? We're on page 82, text 10.
Instructions that we issue to our children must not be a product of whim, but should noticeably flow from our own sense of duty and understanding of right and wrong. When we're thoughtful in the manner in which we allow or disallow a child to do something, and when we're visibly joyful when we give the child the autonomy to do as he or she wishes when appropriate, we demonstrate that whatever we permit or prohibit is not a product of a transient mood, the result of our desire to control the child, or due to our stubbornness. Rather, the child sees that our instruction is a result of careful and objective consideration and thought.
So it turns out Amy McCready above, right, text 3, had a very valid point. This because I told you so is not really an appropriate response to a child. Never was the appropriate response to a child. Why? Because when a child hears, because I told you so, what they hear between the lines is, I am more powerful than you, and therefore you just need to listen to me because you don't know what you're talking about. Right? And that obviously is an unhealthy type of authority. Why? Because the moment that you're just abusing your power, you just happen to be the person empowering, that's the unhealthy type of authority. And the child, by the way, will likely end up resenting that type of authority, etc. But the moment you take your ego out of it, the whole thing changes. Consider this example. We spoke in lesson 1 about the fact that one of the rules of one of the halachot, one of the laws of kibud av va'em, of honoring your parents and having reverence for your parents, is the idea that you're not supposed to sit in your father's chair. Okay? So now, or in your mother's chair. So now, you can walk into a room, the child is sitting in your chair. What's your reaction? Unhealthy authority is, Jimmy, get the bleep out of my chair. That's my chair, and it's disrespectful for you. I'm your father, and you have to respect me, and all those things, right? In that case, what's unhealthy about this type of authority is ego is front and center. It's all about me. It has nothing to do with the child, right? And as a result, it's completely unhealthy authority. But what if instead of doing that, even though this is such a personal matter, it's your chair, it's all about you, instead you say, Jimmy, please get up out of the chair. That is a parent's chair, and we do not sit in a parent's chair. It's disrespectful, right? My wife and I also always try to, if we see the other one being disrespectful, if we see a child being disrespectful to the other one, that's my opportunity to step in. It's not personal. You don't talk to your mother that way. You don't talk to your father that way, right? So it's clearly not personal. It's not even me, right? I'm stepping in now to teach my child the importance of this value of authority and of kibbud. But we kind of segued back into last week's about the importance of having a parental figure, etc. I want to take this back to the fact that it's authority. It's the importance of the fact that we're teaching our children to have a level of authority in our lives. On page 83, we have the exercises for the week. Folks, I know these exercises are hard, but I still want to conclude with asking you to do them. If you have the opportunity this week, I think it would be so valuable for you to write down a recent example of an occasion in which you exerted unhealthy authority over your child, and then try to work on that this week. In the coming week, try to figure out, if you have the urge to react in that type of authoritative manner, ask yourself whether it'll benefit your child in the long run. It's on page 83. The second one is, write down a recent example of an occasion in which you exerted healthy authority over your child in a way that taught them to act responsibly, right? And in the coming week, let's see if you can praise something your child does that demonstrates his or her sense of responsibility, of their authority to God, to someone else, to whatever it is, to you, whatever it is. By the way, for those parents that are in the preschool, this is a great opportunity with mitzvah notes. And even for those that are not, I mean, like some of the Jewish schools have these things. This is a great opportunity for those mitzvah notes, right? Send a note with your child. I'm so proud that my son listened to me when it came to this. They listened. And again, don't say listen to me. You could say listen to their father, listen to their mother. You're sending that message that accepting authority is actually a good thing and a good value for your child to listen to imbibe. Please take a moment. This concludes today's lesson. Please take a moment to turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Key points, Lesson 3. 1. The modern-day weakening of parental authority results in societal advantages, for example, greater sensitivity to the needs of children and the discarding of many institutionalized injustices and disadvantages, moral subjectivity, and greater frequency of narcissistic tendencies. 2. There are two types of authority, one positive and one negative, and both are on the wane. Parents need to completely eliminate the negative authority from their parenting arsenal, while embracing and reinforcing the positive type. 3. Illegitimate authority is power that is exerted for the benefit of a powerful party. The Torah exhorts the powerful, including parents, never to utilize their natural authority to oppress those with less power. 4. The duties and responsibilities that we all have toward God and society constitute the legitimate authority in our lives. Judaism places a premium on the importance of this authority, making our duties and responsibilities the center of our lives. 5. It is important for children to learn from a young age to respect this healthy authority and to have a responsibility first attitude. 6. We enhance our children's sense of and appreciation for responsibility, duty, authority by role modeling such behavior, and also by not always explaining the reasons behind rules, instead emphasizing the importance of following rules simply because we must. 7. We minimize the amount of unhealthy authority we exert over our children by taking our egos out of the equation and not making an issue of ourselves and our authority.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 3. This has been on good authority. I look forward to seeing you all next week for Lesson 4, competence and confidence, where we will talk about raising not only children that have a good sense of responsibility and authority, but now we got to balance it with how do we raise independent children, right? How do we raise children that have their own self-confidence and their ability to shine on their own, so that when they're 25, they're not still living at home. Anyways, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. See you next week.
You are very
Thank
welcome.
you.